Now let's look at question 5 in your assignment titled Midpoints and Lines. And if you see what we've got going on here, it's kind of a lot. We have 4 different lines on 5 and on number 6. We're asked to determine the lengths of the segments using the distance formula and then find the coordinates of the midpoint. So let's kind of remind ourselves about midpoint formula and distance formula. It may have been kind of a long time since you've dealt with these. So let's start there. First of all, midpoint formula gives us the actual location of the center of a segment. And midpoint formula tells us that the midpoint is at the average of the x values for the x term and the average of the y values for the y term. So let's say that we were dealing with segments that had an endpoint of 2, -5 and the other endpoint of 6, -1. And we wanted to find the midpoint of this segment. So we would be able to take our first point and label it as x1, y1, our second point as x2, y2. Just plug the information into midpoint formula. So we would know that the midpoint is at the x2 minus x2 plus x1 over 2, finding the average, and the y2 plus y1, so -1 plus a -5 over 2. 6 plus 2 is 8, and 8 halves makes 4, so our x value for the midpoint would be 4. Our y values, we have a positive times a negative, which is a negative, so -1 minus 5 over 2, or -6 over 2 is a -3, so our midpoint would be at the point 4, -3. Now, using the same segment with the endpoints at 2, -5 and 6, -1, we could find the length of that segment by finding the distance from one endpoint to the other endpoint. So let's take a look at distance formula. Distance formula is d equals the square root of x2 minus x1 quantity squared plus y2 minus y1 quantity squared. So again, we're using our 0.1 and our 0.2 values and just plugging them in to a formula. Get the basic template set up here, and we'll plug our information in. So we're starting with x2 minus x1. So we have 6 minus 2. And then we have our y2 minus y1, which in this case is -1 minus a -5. Sorry, I didn't give myself any space there. We'll clean that up real quick. So we would have 6 minus 2, which is 4. We'll square that. And -1 minus a -5 is -1 plus 5, which gives us a positive 4. And we'll square that as well. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 4 is 16. So we know that the distance is the square root of 32. Well, that's true, it's not real exact. Sometimes it's a little better to know exactly. So let's go ahead and just put that into our calculator and find out what the square root of 32 actually is. And that is 5.66. We'll go ahead and just put a unit of measure on there. So the distance from one endpoint to the other in this case is 5.66 units. So we were able to find the midpoint and the distance of the segment with those two endpoints. So what you're asked to do on your particular assignment is to do this whole process that we just did right here for each segment, right? So this would be 1 out of 4 that you would do for each problem. So it takes a little bit of time, but it's good practice working with midpoint and distance.